Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for another episode. Today, I'm joined by Teodora, who is a content marketer and former journalist all the way from Italy. So I'm really excited to talk to her as we dive into a topic that is so linked to social media, and that is fake news, sentiment analysis, and crisis communications. So today's conversation is one I'm really looking forward to having because it sits right at the intersection of everything that we're dealing with, especially online right now. And I think that's why it's really important that we understand when we're creating content that we're actually managing the impact of it and how our audience might receive it and how the world might receive it for brands that are for larger brands and more out there in the public. So Teodora, I'm really excited to have you. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your background?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jennifer, for having me on your podcast. A bit about me. So I'm a former journalist turned into content marketer. I work with brands of all sizes, from startups to enterprise level companies. I do a bit of social media for myself, a bit of social media for my clients. I used to live on Twitter at some point. Now I'm spending less and less time on X and on social media in general, but it still eats probably too much of my day. So I'm very happy we get to talk about this topic in particular because honestly, like it's everywhere, right? Fake news is everywhere, misinformation is everywhere, and this feels like the perfect of times to educate more, to talk more, to try to give people a second perspective to things. So thank you for having me.
Yes, that's a great point. I was also a big X user. I feel like I've shifted more into LinkedIn which it kind of feels like you have as well. But fake news is something that we see across all platforms and is something as marketers that we have to deal with. And I think people hear fake news, but we don't always stop to actually define what that is. So, fake news is essentially false or misleading information that is often presented as real news. But what makes it powerful and dangerous is how fast it spreads. So, Teodora, from your perspective, why does fake news spread so quickly on social media in particular?
Oh, well, in part is the algorithm, but I wouldn't go directly there because probably it's easy to blame the tool. It's our behavior. So forever, ever before social media, since forever, journalists had this pressure to be the first to report on something, right? And that wasn't a fact. It wasn't something that just happened for an editor or for a publication to want out of a sudden. No, the first who gives the news is the one who will take that news, the further. Um, it's important to be the first, and when something is novelty enough, people will just react to it. Some out of rage, some out of curiosity, some out of um, a feeling of validation. So I feel it spreads so fast um, because it has that new element to it more than anything else, and we're attracted to everything that is new and that shakes a bit our lives. And many of us live in monotony. We go to social media to entertain ourselves, to catch up, and you scroll, you scroll, you scroll, and the novelty will stick with you and will, I don't know if force is the right word, but it will force a reaction out of you more than something that you've already seen 3, 5, 10 times.
Yeah, that's a really great distinction that fake news has always been around. Journalists have always had to toe that line between getting interest in their story and being too sensational. And I agree that I think so much of it ties back to the reaction that we hope to get from our audience. And it seems like a social media problem, but it isn't one platform or social media in particular. It's human nature to react to things that maybe are not accurate, but are shocking, emotional, or controversial. But the reality is, when we talk about it related to social media, it just gets pushed further, faster, even if it's completely false, due to the algorithm and due to what the networks reward in terms of content being seen by more people. So you're not really just competing with other brands, you're competing with the most emotionally charged version of a story. Can you share an example of an emotionally charged headline that you've dealt with for a brand and how that turned out?
Oh, Well, I'm not going to go for a huge example. I'm not going to go for something that probably, has been already talked about. I'll take a very simple one, something that I had in my inbox this morning, for example, right? So it's not even a headline; it's a subject line. So it says, should I fire my copywriter? Now, pay attention to this because I'm a content marketer and a copywriter. So that's very emotionally triggering to me, right? So it seems like the most innocent of the subject lines. Should I fire my copywriter? But for me, that had a huge emotional impact. And it was perfectly tailored because this is also very important in fake news. You can polish that fake news and create 7, 10, 100 versions of it to match every audience you try to target, right? Because you're not loyal to the truth, so you can shape that truth the best way to trigger an emotion in the audience that you're targeting. So for me, in my case, that subject line said, should I fire my copywriter? Maybe if was someone there who was, I know they have a segmented list and somebody else was a lawyer, probably their subject line was, should I fire my lawyer? So then you open that email and you see that it's very misleading because the story was about something else and about, yes, AI, but in a different context. And it had a happy ending. No one got fired. But, this is something that appears innocent. That seems like, they just wanted to have a high open rate, right? They just wanted to incentivize you in some way to open that. And honestly, I wouldn't have opened it if it weren't, because I think that I start to develop um, let's say, a mechanism to protect myself from these tricks. This would be the goal, right? To protect ourselves from these tricks and these triggers that are not good for us. But in knowing that we would have this conversation today, it felt like the right example, let's say, of it's not fake news, but it's misleading information. So
Yeah, and the writer knew exactly what they were doing to really elicit that emotional reaction from the audience. And, we're kind of using it for personal gain to get you to open the email.
exactly, and it's in the little things. You don't need a huge headline, right? From, I don't know, there are so many examples of misleading information, brands who are paying the price for because someone spread half truths about them. Let's not call them fake news because sometimes it's not even all fake. Sometimes it's just half of a truth or something taken out of context. But before it happens on a large scale, it also happens in the very little universes that we all live in our daily lives.
Yeah,
And
that's a great point.
yeah,
So let's dive into misinformation versus disinformation because you brought up that point too, that the intent is very important behind it. And brands do suffer from both sides of this. We have news stories and headlines that are very misleading intentionally, but then we also have more of the disinformation side where it is still false but unintentional. Or sorry, with the misinformation side. So let me dive into these definitions specifically. So we have misinformation, which is characterized as false but not intentional. So that's maybe a half truth, someone sharing something when they don't realize that it is found to not be factual. And then we have disinformation, which is false and intentional, where the author or organization knows what they're doing to elicit that emotional appeal or shocking news or controversial headline. Do you think that intent actually matters when you're managing a brand or crisis, whether that's from disinformation or misinformation?
the intent, like if I'm just like to say, at first sight, I said, of course, intent matters, right? Like, of course it does. But if you start like taking it layer by layer, um, whose intent are we talking about? Like, does it matter if you put that fake news out there out of because you really don't know what's happening or because you want to do harm? I believe that most people who spread misinformation or disinformation, the people who share, who repost the tweet or repost the post or reshare that video on TikTok that goes viral, I don't think there's a bad intent there. Probably most people don't even realize how harmful their behavior is. But at the end of the day, does it really matter? No, because the harm's been done. Like you had zero intent to harm the brand when you decided to repost that TikTok video where that had a bad review in it, right? You just wanted to warn your friends, and that's good intent. But nobody verified that information. It turns out it's fake after a couple of hours. But what will you do? Will you go back and write an apology post to all your friends that I'm sorry I shared that? No, you had the best of intents. You wanted your people, your audience, your friends to be warned, and you already harmed that. So it does matter in terms of conscience. Probably I did it with the best of intentions, but for the brand whose reputation was damaged, I don't think the intent matters as much because the harm's been done.
Yeah,
And
and like they're still having to deal with it because from a strategy standpoint, whether the intent was neutral or negative, I mean, brands still typically have to respond to some of this viral content if it's really harming their reputation or something else that they have going on. But from the brand side, you do have options. You know, if it's that misinformation where it's false but not intentional, then maybe you might have an opportunity to educate followers or the world about something with your brand. Now, if it's disinformation, when that's more false and intentional, you might need to actively counter or correct. But I think from the brand side, it's always really difficult because once that news goes viral, it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle and try to rein in those headlines because that misinformation is out there and the corrected info is never going to go as far, especially in the newsfeed, because it's not going to benefit from that sensationalism that really originates that sharing in the first place. All right, so I want to share an example of this. So FEMA is an emergency organization here in the US that responds to emergencies from the federal government. And after Hurricane Helene a few years ago, FEMA was actively providing aid, but misinformation, which again is not intentional, but is still found to be not factual, was spread very quickly on social media after the hurricane happened. So common false claims included FEMA wasn't helping, the survivors were being denied aid, conspiracy theories about withheld support were circulating, and especially this, old or unrelated videos were shared as current information that were really hogging a lot of the headlines. And really, why it spread was because there was high emotion around it and uncertainty because of this hurricane. The algorithms were pushing that viral, sensational content. There was gaps in early information, as there often is after emergencies, because government agencies and their partners are trying to get their arms around information to know what to put out. And there was already an existing distrust of government and information that might be shared about the emergency. So, from the FEMA side, from the brand side, there were a lot of challenges for them. One was slower verified communication versus fast information. So, again, they were taking time to make sure that their messages were factual, but they were behind in terms of the news cycle on what was being shared online. Messaging wasn't always consistent across the agencies. That can be a big problem during emergencies where you might have FEMA saying one thing and you have the local or state government saying something else, which again is probably not intentional and is just the result of a chaotic environment, but can continue to build mistrust, especially when people are already a little wary of trusting government. And the official tone didn't match the emotional viral content. So we run into this a lot on the brand side that the content that's circulating online doesn't seems very casual or sensational. And then the brands respond in the brand voice, and it can be seen as disingenuous because the tone is just so different from that of the story. And so FEMA's ultimate response to this was they did a lot of myth busting posts, they did frequent updates, and they partnered with trusted local voices to help correct a lot of that information. So a key takeaway here from this example was that if you don't fill the information gap quickly in a crisis, misinformation will typically spread because people are desperate for info and they'll be sharing from anyone. And there will surely be news organizations or influencers out there who will take advantage of that opportunity to go viral and put information out that is not necessarily fully accurate. So, Teodora, have you seen brands struggle with when to respond versus ignore when information is being shared very quickly?
oh, I think again that there are many stories about what has been done, what should have been done. There are many experts who would come and say, oh yeah, but they should have managed that crisis differently. I don't know, someone tweets something like a CEO tweets something in a moment, right? Of they have a creative moment, no one's around, and they share a tweet that they will regret sharing later. I'm sorry, I know it's called something else on X. I'm just missing the term now. So, and then there will be an expert who says, oh, but they should have managed the crisis. No, sometimes staying quiet probably is the best way. I mean, because there's a huge risk of amplifying the fake news. Um, there are so
Another
many.
thing that I find very scary from the brand side too is that if it's so hard, because I totally agree with you that it's easy to criticize other brands, but the reality is when information is being shared really quickly, the last thing you want as the brand is to go out and get involved in something or confirm something that is found later to be not true. And I think that this can be really true when it's someone's take on something that happened, or maybe a passenger or a customer and it was their experience. And then later on, different things come out that, like, oh, maybe there were half truths involved or things were exaggerated. And there can be a lot of risk for the brand in responding too quickly. So I think it can be really difficult on the marketing side to figure out where that balance is.
Well, it's easy to criticize also because, let's be honest, most of us and most of the critics, right, have never had to deal with a true global crisis. Luckily for us, or I don't know. So we all talk from our very small. Like I worked with and I work with relatively small brands. Nobody comes to criticize a small brand's reaction to something. They all go and criticize the largest possible brand reaction to something, right? So you don't know how it feels like to manage communication that goes, I don't know, on 5 continents. But the fake news, the misinformation, the bad review, those will spread like fire. Your answer needs to somehow reflect that you are aware of all the cultural differences that you need to cover for. And sometimes there's really a crisis situation, like right now I see there's a growing conflict right in the Middle East, and there are so many people who live there and who share videos from their day to day and say, oh, there's nothing happening here. And then you see on the news that something is happening. And then 3 hours later, somebody else would come, oh, there's a bomb happening, like, I don't know, 5 miles from where I live. So this need to fill the void, to say something all the time, probably also contributes. And I feel like the only way for a brand to actually know when to talk and when to stay quiet is to have a team of experts ready to help. And ideally, some of those experts don't come from within the organization. There is someone who isn't emotional about it, who isn't emotionally involved, right? So I think that's the only way to actually handle a major crisis, is to have somebody from the outside, an expert, a PR expert, or I don't know, a communication expert, someone who knows the brand well but is not emotionally involved with the brand. Because you can't tell me, like, you're in that team every day and you produce content for the team every day and you handle marketing or PR, or it's impossible for you not to be emotionally connected. You need someone from the outside to come and just have you breathe for a moment and say, does it really need to be said? This, do you really need to have such a, I don't know, massive response to a tiny thing, or do you really need to say something right now instead of just waiting 3 hours from now and see where the conversation is going?
That is a great point. And we're going to dive into that more in just a little bit when we talk about sentiment analysis, because when we're talking about either our internal teams or external teams that we're relying on, that is plays a huge role, or should play a huge role, in how we really determine if we need to respond to something. So that's a great point. But the thing that I find about all this is it's just human. People don't believe fake news randomly. Like, we're wired to believe things that match what we already think. And I think that this can be a huge thing that we see play out, especially on social. And when we believe things that match what we already think, this is actually called confirmation bias. And we've been talking about misinformation, but I think what makes it even harder is how people are often seeing misinformation inside of echo chambers, which is where everything they see reinforces what they already believe. And how should communicators think about breaking through that? when I think it comes to echo chambers, people don't recognize, or people that don't understand the way social and algorithms work don't recognize the way that that can really significantly impact the information that we're seeing and how we are actually seeing and responding to something that's happening. Because everything that we're seeing and engaging with, whether we realize it or not, maybe we pause when we're scrolling or we like or comment on something, the algorithm is learning all of those signals about us that just contributes to those echo chambers that many of us do live in online. So, Teodora, what strategies can brands or communicators use to reach people who are inside those echo chambers and may not trust that outside information?
Oh, well, probably when I will have a correct and comprehensive answer to that, I would have fixed a major internet issue and I would have like a bunch of millions in my account because everybody would want my strategy, right? I don't think there is one strategy that could be like universally applied to enter in these echo chambers. And let me explain. I notice, right, like being on so many different platforms and after so many years of trying to understand people, is that not all of them will choose these echo chambers for the same reasons. So probably it doesn't matter what strategy you go for as long as you go with empathy. And maybe I'm wrong, but it's something I've noticed when we think about these places, these segments of audiences, we tend to be somehow patronizing and feel superior, as in, this could never be me because I'm open-minded and I listen to both sides, and I don't know, I have better sources for information, I read better newspapers, or I read better websites, or I read more books. And sometimes we forget the most important thing: empathy. What has caused that echo chamber to become such an important part of someone's life in the first place? Why do they choose to only listen to one side of the story? What's the backstory? Like, what triggers this kind of behavior? Because yes, there's confirmation bias, as you said. There's the need to stay around people who share our beliefs, to create our groups, our communities, right? At the end of the day, but if there's no empathy, if there's no capacity to actually go and put yourself in that people's shoes, like, you can't break through. I mean, your message will feel disconnected, and you won't be able to actually get to that person's heart and make them change their mind. Also, because there's, I wouldn't say massive, but important effort put into creating these divisions and in consolidating these echo chambers, because that's the way you can manipulate populations. That's the way you can control how the information flows. So the strategy can't be one size fits all. Depending on where you want to go and what audience you want to reach, you might have to go with a different strategy, whether that's, I don't know, including more communication channels, or partnering with local influencers, or partnering with huge influencers, or simply, I don't know, going for something offline rather than staying online, like trying to reach them outside the internet. It
Yeah,
really
that's a great
depends
point.
a lot.
And I think what you're describing is a good segue into our next topic, which is helping us all develop good media literacy. And that is really important during times that are not emotional and heightened, for us to be aware of and to help educate people on, because it becomes critically important when emotions are heightened and there's a crisis or an emergency happening, that we can really pull back and prevent our susceptibility to some of these sensational headlines by recognizing really what's happening. So, media literacy is vital for distinguishing between reliable and unreliable sources. And this is a really important thing to point out, that understanding journalistic standards and fact checking processes is really critical when we talk about information that we see online. And there's actually the Society of Professional Journalists that has a code of ethics that all journalists must follow. So when we're seeing information from a news organization, and again, it can be misleading to call something a news organization because they may not adhere to this code of ethics, but major platforms like AP News here in the US and Reuters and the BBC, they do stick to this code of ethics that does change their stake in the information that they're reporting. It's really important to distinguish that many people who might call themselves news influencers do not have an organization like that they're a member of. They may not have even been to journalism school where maybe they've learned about some of these really key components of storytelling. So it's really important to understand that right off the bat, that there's very different standards for the information that's being shared there just based on who you're affiliated with. So, question for you, when it comes to news influencers versus traditionally trained journalists, how do you think this impacts the news stories that we see gain traction online? And as a former journalist, I'm sure you have thoughts on this too.
Oh, I have too many thoughts. Fortunately, I can say that the fact that you're a journalist or just an influencer, it doesn't change it. I've seen many journalists who don't even consider the code of ethics, right? So they, of course, there's also so much pressure. So sometimes it's not the individual, it's the whole publication, and the individual just gets tired of fighting, right? A system that doesn't support it, and it support fair journalism in any way. So I don't think that at this point we can simply consider, like fair journalism, like traditional journalists are better than influencers or the other way around. I feel like what needs to happen for gaining this advantage as a consumer of information, of content, is to try to find sources that have different interests. So the same story told by three different people will vary, right? And when the truth is not a priority, then it will vary even more. So what I can say is that if you have doubts, I mean, yes, I follow BBC as well, and I trust the institution, but at the same time, I do realize that not everybody has my same beliefs. And if you don't trust the BBC, that's okay. Just find, I don't know, 2 other publications with different editorial platforms and try to see whether there's some truth in that story. And if you find 3 different versions of the story and you don't know which to believe, then look for a 4th one. And maybe you will never know the truth, but you will have more perspective. Because I mean, it's easy for us to say, like, yeah, follow the traditional, but the problem is that some people don't trust anymore these traditional organizations. And I think that if we say just trust those because we trust them, it's just going to we're not going to go or break the echo chamber. I feel like, yes, follow the news and follow the institutions you believe in, but at the same time, like, find 2, 3 who aren't necessarily agreeing with you, but who can give you a different perspective. You don't necessarily need to agree with that, but at least there's another version of the truth out there.
Yeah, it's good to just check headlines and see if the narratives in general are being supported by multiple news organizations or news influencers or whatever it is. That typically the more true something is, the more you're going to see it spread through all different forms of media. Another thing that I like to add too is don't forget to look at the date. Misinformation often involves outdated content. So we have to try to check whether the information is current or taken out of context from an earlier time. That's getting harder and harder to do with AI. But Google can be a tool with this. Like, you can actually upload images into Google and see if there's some traction there on an image maybe being circulated at an earlier time. And it can be really hard, especially today, to continue to differentiate between that. But don't forget to, during breaking news, to check official government or organizational social media accounts or press releases for verification, not saying that the brand is going to be fully truthful or accurate in the way that they're portraying a story, but they are another source that you can go to try to piece the information together in addition to other news sources to have a more full picture of what might actually be going on.
And I'd like to add here, especially if you're on TikTok, for example, and you use TikTok to get your news, there are no dates on those videos. So this is going back to your checking the date. Especially on TikTok, you need to go and find another channel. And also there are many, I wouldn't say fake accounts, but there's only one official account for a brand or for an organization, and many fake with similar names. Sometimes in the rush of the moment, trying to confirm something, you might hit the wrong account. And this is something else that you should pay attention to, right? Because There are so many trying to impersonate the real source, not necessarily from a with a as much bad intention to harm or to spread the misinformation. It's simply a matter of the higher you are and the more eyeballs you get on your content, then the better for your business, right? So I think these are also important to
Yeah,
add.
that's a great point. And shifting into that, let's talk about sentiment analysis. We hit on it a little bit ago, but this is actually something that we can use to determine the severity of headlines. And at its core, sentiment analysis helps you understand how people feel about your brand, what they're saying, and how that's changing over time. And there are many different AI tools and more coming online all the time that can help us do this. But good social media managers are tuned into their communities and can look at the comment section and know whether followers are positive, negative, or neutral on certain topics. How have you seen brands use sentiment data effectively to help them get a fuller picture of how people are feeling about a certain issue?
Oh, I think most of them are, I wouldn't say mastering it, but doing efforts in that direction. There are like, I think Hootsuite is one of the. Am I allowed to say that? I hope I am.
Yeah.
There,
Yep.
who provides these tools where you can actually listen to your audience and measure somehow, the sentiment behind some of the comments. Yes, I do believe AI can help with that, but I would like highlight what you said, right? The good social media manager is there manually checking comments, reading and trying to understand, what generates a specific reaction. And also, why not compare it with what the regular day looks like? Because this is also important. If your fans are hyped all the time, then probably it's nothing. But if they're hyped out of a sudden when they're usually very quiet, then definitely something is happening. So I feel like AI can help you see some patterns that you couldn't on your own because there's so much information out there. But at the same time, like having that person who's always involved, who can actually confirm the that AI has confirmed the pattern that AI has found, it is always the right and best solution. And I've seen more companies invest in like larger social media teams so that they can monitor more. There are more people involved, more points of view. I think there's work being done in this area. I It's very hard to give an example, right? Because sometimes
Yeah. Well, and
they're
I think it's hard too because there's many brands that don't invest in this early. And like anything else in marketing, you really want to have a plan and have resources ahead of time because once something happens, it's very hard to rein that back in. And so I think like obviously the AI tools can help us identify, are we seeing more positive or are we seeing more negative around these certain topics? But it really does require a human touch that requires that investment ahead of time.
and also like it's important to notice here that some brands will do overall pretty well, and then they will have like their um hiccup at some point, a faux pas at some point, and then they will be mostly judged for what went wrong one day, but not for was what was great for 3 years in a row, right? So like with, I don't know, Duolingo is the most classic, I feel, social media branding case study that we can come up with, and everybody praised them for years, but then when something went wrong, now out of a sudden Duolingo is no longer the reference case study because hey, they made a mistake one day. So I feel like this is also important to mention that um, you can have your bad days and still do a good
Yeah.
job
I think if you
doing.
write out one crisis as a marketer for any brand, and that can be smaller to like a really large scale crisis, I think it just gives you empathy. Like whenever I see a brand in the headlines, I always have empathy for their communications team because it is so complicated and it is impossible to know what's going on behind the scenes when we see those crises unfold. So I always like to lead with empathy as far as all that's concerned.
Exactly. I think that should guide all our um, actions online.
Yep. So well said. I think too, another thing that when we're looking at sentiment analysis, and yes, we can look at positive and negative, another big thing that will happen with brands, especially on social, is when things really become a major issue, you're going to see comments bleed over into unrelated content. So you're not just going to see comments on one post. You're going to start to see that same topic show up on your other posts and content, maybe from the last week or the last month. And I think that's another big red flag when you kind of know, like, oh man, this is like really shifting where it's controlling a lot of the narrative that as a brand, you really have to look a little bit more into. And I think in general, just sentiment can really help us identify responding faster, adjusting our messaging. Most importantly, we have real-time feedback about how statements from the company are being received. It can help us identify issues before they escalate. And we can look through the comments to see different trends about what people are saying. But again, looking at that and being aware of, like you said, looking at your daily baseline for how your audience normally reacts and how your other content is performing, you can really start to see some early warning signs of a crisis brewing there that can really help us be more responsive as a brand.
And there's another thing to highlight here. I'm not sure if this is saved for later in the conversation, but whenever something bad happens and you have a communication crisis, people who aren't even part of your audience will show up. People who've never interacted with your content before this day, this moment, and who will never after this moment. But right now they feel like they have something to say, right? So again, that's why here AI might not see the nuance, and you need your regular people to chime in and decide whether this is a real crisis or if this is just a fire fueled by haters with nothing else to do. You need to see who's actually commenting and how many of these people you already know, how many of these people match your regular audience. So this should be somehow correlated. Sentiment analysis with what's changed in your in your audience's demographics, what's changed in their interest, because might be just as well that you, on all this smoke created by negative reactions from people who've never engaged with your brand before, you missed the important picture. No one from your regular audience is involved because they actually don't care about the smoke. They're still loyal to your brand as it was before this scandal. So I feel this is an important thing to consider. I'm not saying ignoring everyone who hasn't been with you, or I'm not saying that some people are more important than others, but I am saying that who's been loyal to you might actually treat you more gently, and you should probably focus on those people, on the good part, rather than following some trolls or haters, or simply forgetting to see the forest for the trees.
Yep, that's a great point. It's just keeping perspective. And I think trying to keep emotion out of it as much as we can. And data can give us the information to help us do that, to look at all these different parts and see them as part of a bigger story to help us figure out how to respond. But when it comes to crisis communication, like we've talked about with a lot of other things in marketing, it's important to have a plan before the crisis happens. And that plan can really boil down to knowing who's going to speak on behalf of your brand, what will the message be, and how will you monitor sentiment? And I think having an idea of those three things can be really helpful. And when it comes down to thinking through what the message is, I think doing some emergency planning for your brand, and that could be a small brand all the way up to a very large brand, is having perspective on what is most likely to gain traction online about your brand. You know, if you're a police agency, maybe that's an officer involved shooting. You know, if you're a brand who manufactures some kind of food, like maybe it's some kind of recall or someone getting sick from your food. So really thinking through what those key issues are going to be and thinking ahead of time, what would we need? What are the things that we need to be thinking about to identify if this information is accurate and how would we respond? Because when things start happening, it moves very fast, and it can be helpful to have a checklist there to pull back from and try to take the emotion out of it. But some other things to keep in mind just related to crisis communications is just we really need to focus on listening. So we've talked a lot about that with sentiment analysis, trying to have an understanding. Is it mostly positive? Is it mostly negative? Where is that negativity coming from? What stakeholder group is that coming from? And are they all created equal as far as their feelings about your company? We want to always respond with facts as the brand, and that can be very difficult to do because a lot of crises and sensational headlines will evolve in emotion that the brand shouldn't be involved in. And I think another important thing is that we just typically shouldn't ignore it. And you talked about this before, that we run the risk of amplification. So sometimes if we respond to something, there are people out there who didn't even see that headline. And now we've kind of fanned the fire because we responded to something that maybe didn't warrant it. And ultimately, we should build relationships before we need them, because whether it's inside our organization or, like you talked about, having a crisis team that you rely on outside of your organization, it's really important to think about that ahead of time, because once things start building around a crisis, it's very hard to have any time to do any of that. So you want to make sure that you have a little pre-planning done to have your ducks in a row. So overall, how do you balance correcting misinformation without unintentionally amplifying it, do you think?
Well, I'm thinking a lot about this, and I feel like the only solution here is not to make your truth, your version, a follow up. So, as you said, there are people out there who haven't seen where it all started from. But if you're making your truth a follow up of this story, they will end up going and Googling or asking AI, hey, what happened? What are they talking about? So I would make all communication, all crisis communication, standalone. Like, tell your truth as it is. It doesn't need to. You don't need an excuse to tell your story or to share your data or to, I don't know, promote your version of your company. So don't use this as, look, I need to answer to this, or I need to have a response. No, make it a standalone. Push it as a normal campaign. You don't have to provide an answer to something. Just it's not changing the narrative, it's just setting things straight. So don't make your version a follow-up. That's the only way you can balance it. Don't mention what triggered it. Of course, people will know, some won't know. There are nuances to it, important nuances that a team of external experts and your in-house experts will be able to manage. So again, this is very important, having someone who isn't emotionally impacted, who isn't so much involved as your regular people. But overall, you don't need an excuse to tell your story as a brand or as a person. So
Yep.
don't make
We
it an excuse, don't justify when you answer to something. Don't justify it. Like, do your thing and own it. And if you have to say I'm sorry, I mean, if that thing has some certain level of truth in it, apologize and own it. Like, not necessarily as a response, as much as this is what I am as a brand and this is what we stand for. And there's no shame in being yourself online.
Yep, that's a great point. And I think if there's one thing I want students to take away from this conversation, it's that we're not just content creators. We're really all out there managing trust, perception, and sometimes that misinformation in real time. And there's no one right answer to any situation that you're going to encounter in communications and marketing. And we've talked about a lot of different things that we can keep in mind. But the reality is that we'll never get it perfect 100% of the time, because the sentiment of our public is always changing. And so having empathy for ourselves and for any teams that we see go through crises, yeah, there's more effective ways to weather different things that are going on with your organization. But ultimately, even the best teams can be struck down by misinformation, because it's just getting harder and harder to control and manage sometimes from the brand side. But Teodora, thank you so much for being here for this great conversation. Do you have any final advice for students that are entering the marketing and communications field?
Oh, there's so much to say, and there's so much unsolicited advice out there. If there's one thing that I wish I knew when I started, is that there's so much information out there, and overall it's overwhelming, but at the same time, it has one huge advantage: people forget faster than they used to. So no marketing tragedy, or very, very few marketing tragedies, are forever. And sometimes you just have to, own your mistake, say I'm sorry, and instead of focusing on what happened, and instead of focusing on how you could have avoided it, just focus on how to fix it and how to stay true to the people who support you, to your customers, to your potential customers, like, in the deal pipeline, to your audience, to your community. To focus on the people who support you, not on the people who hate you in the heat of the moment. Focus on there's always a good side. In every crisis, there's always a good side. Focus on that.
Yes, that's really good parting thoughts because it's a big industry and it's always changing. And we can try to prepare as much as possible, but sometimes things are just outside of our control. And we're all trying to just manage that the best we can. So, Teodora, thank you so much for being here again. It was lovely chatting about this.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always challenging to talk about it, because every time, like, there's, as we said, even with the best of intention, we risk harming someone. And I feel like we need to be aware of this and spread the good news more than the bad news.
Industry to be involved in, even though there are many challenges that keep us on our toes from time to time.
Absolutely, yes.
All right, give me 1 second. I'm going to stop the recording.